So, welcome everyone. For those who do not know me, my name is Cipriani, and today I will introduce the book Co-Designing Hope, Aqueous Landscape in Transition, which Routledge published last September. This book was initially conceived during the Crisis and Hope Landscape as Possibility conference series organized at Delft in 2020. So the writing of the first chapter with the actions for landscape in transition was the seed of this book, which subsequently led me to contact the contributors for each of the topics outlined. Firstly, special thanks are due to all the contributors of the book for making this project possible. Many thanks to the generous Stitching NH Voss Foundation, to Delft, and Fulbright for sponsoring the book and today's event. And many thanks for the assistance of today. We actually have a problem here in the screen sometimes. I will introduce the book's third chapter, and then we will start. Oh, sorry. And then we will start with a conversation with some contributors in each of the book sections. So let's start opening together the book. The book opens with a quote by Antoine Lavoisier: "Nothing is lost, nothing is created, everything is transformed." Because transition is a process and water is always unstable since it constantly moves in the water cycle, from the soil to the groundwater, from rivers to the ocean, from the sea to the atmosphere. Evaporation, transpiration, condensation, precipitation, infiltration are the physical processes of this constant movement. And today, climate change upsets water cycles and evaporation phenomena, increasing extreme weather events, droughts, floods. But the global water balance at the planetary level remains essentially constant. And it's also like this quote because it encourages us not to despair and wait for hopeful times. We are in a process of transformation. And that's why this book gathers essays on aqueous landscape facing climate change challenges and hopes that can spring from collective design in its broader meaning, involving all living and non-living systems. So how can landscape design and different forms of collaboration open new doors to face climate and water challenges? This book sets out notions and ideas on landscape and co-design practices, identifying what awful routes might be taken for the three states of the aqueous landscape in transition: liquid, solid, and gas. It's a testament to the fact that people, animals, plants, water, ice, fog, clouds, wind, sand, and rocks all contribute to the cosmos landscape symphony, and designing together can become a seed of hope to listen and embrace the Earth's climate changes. The essays are organized into three states of water relating to climate change. The opening section, liquid water, discusses collaborative design practices in coastal and riverine areas. The second section, solid ice, question the solidity of ice in the age of climate change. And the final section, gas, fog, and clouds, collects the design practices related to the first state of water aimed at making water from clouds, fog, and moisture. Finally, in the conclusion, we will go to the very roots of the meaning of co-designing, highlighting a symphonic choreography of all planetary forces involved in the water cycles and beyond. And then it's an interdependent design dance that can listen to the cosmos needs and employs aesthetics and techniques to address the climate crisis. Like we said, landscape design is a product of a plural collective symphony that evolves and originates from living systems and natural forces, from hydrologists to botanists, fishermen to farmers, swallow to sheep, fish, rain to wind. All of the Earth system constantly draw landscapes. The actors involved in the collaborative dance of the cosmos incessantly design landscapes with a complex and often indecipherable plan. And this introductory chapter sets out numbers of ideas on landscape, the water and the climate crisis, and how designing together can become a seed of hope to listen and embrace the Earth's climatic changes. I felt it essential to set out 10 axioms, observation, notions, and ideas. Defining certain actions concerned with uncertainty and change is a risky undertaking, but I feel it helps to crystallize specific familiar issues and identify what routes might be taken when discussing Aqueous landscape in the climate crisis. 10 axioms concerned water are proposed in the book with a focus on the axiom of design. The axiom of design is the one that I care the most, because design is crucial to getting out of the different crises we face. Among the many current crises, I see two as being particularly significant. The first, which concerns the climate, is very well known, and we are now seeing how serious the outlook has become. Extreme events, droughts, floods, shifting precipitation, temperature patterns, melting glaciers, sea level rise, water salinization, and general changes in the water cycle remind us that the climate crisis is mostly a water crisis. The second, and perhaps even more serious, I would say, is a crisis of imagination that is connected with thoughts and creative, far-sighted actions capable of combining the visionary and the pragmatic. Notably, design and designers seem less relevant in the climate discourse. Most books and publications outside the design realm focus on the hazards presented by the climate crisis, rather than on the opportunities it might offer us. In my estimation, a response to these two crises can be provided by the disciplines of landscape architecture. This has always been featured an interdisciplinary approach focusing on water, environmental and ecological issues, the involvement of the community, living and non-living system in the design process, and the inclusion of the time variable in future plans, yet without neglecting the necessary flexibility of creative and pragmatic thinking. The design axiom is addressed through 5 corollaries. The climate crisis prompts and demands a change in the paradigm, design, and tools employed. In short, climate changes design. Design is the tool needed to emerge from the multiple crises we are in. It's a choice between destructive pessimism and constructive pessimism. Our preference as designer is for the latter, and that's the point of it. 2 of the corollaries are dedicated to collaboration and co-designs, because collaborative design means to highlight landscape design as the product of a plural, collective symphony that involves or originates from living systems and natural forces, like we said before. In the context of collective complex behavior, physicist Giorgio Parisi, who has studied the flight of flocks, attempted to explain how collective behaviors are derived from the behavior of an individual, for example, a single bird. Each flock member can communicate to move coherently, producing a single collective and plural entity. And the beauty and technique of this natural performance remind us that co-design requires both of these factors, especially in times of crisis. In the concluding chapter of this book, Knox and Holmes refer to the term choreography, since the landscape forces can simultaneously design a technical and poetic composition in constructed landscapes. As you will see in the list, the last axiom is the axiom of hope. With various etymological roots, the word hope also includes the concept of landscape. The Old English hope indicates a valley, a small bay, an entrance, a refuge. So landing from the sea or reaching the high parts of the mountains induces a feeling of hope in man. But also the Indo-European root of hope, which is per, refers to moving toward a destination and therefore changing direction toward a probable and desirable future, a confident optimism of one's destiny and that of one of the world. As we will sustain in this book, hope considers the potential of imagination that landscape architecture can drive through a collective co-design practice. This opening section, Liquid Water, discusses collaborative design practices in coastal and riverine areas. Veenstra proposes a collective design manifesto outlining 10 climate-adaptive principles drafted with 8 landscape design agencies. In his well-known project, Georges de Combe envisions the Aire River as a co-designer. The designer initiated the process, but then the river designed its routes. Martini promotes the need to go beyond the rigid defense infrastructure in Japan and co-design for a better future with local communities and natural elements. Addressing Southeast Asian coastal delta mega cities, Yarina advocates for overcoming predetermined models or imported design projects and producing new local and collective imaginaries of resilience. Bobbink and Chouaïri discuss a traditional water system as the product of collective thinking by local communities. Brashear decomposes the escape and manifesto work, leading breakwaters as a social and ecological engine for collective engagement. And finally, in this session, Georgiev brings us under the sea to fight the climate crisis through collaboration among researchers, academics, biologists, fishermen, divers, artists, and the silent work of marine living systems. So I would invite the first Peter and Inge to sit with us for the first round table of discussion of the book. Let me introduce all the people who will be with us, also online later on. Veenstra is one of the founding partners of LOLA, Landscape Architects in Rotterdam. Inge Bobbink is Associate Professor in Landscape Architecture at Delft. Amina Chouaïri is a PhD student in Urbanism at Venice University, UR. Lizzie Yarina is a doctoral candidate at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Pippa Brashear is the Resilience Principal Escape Landscape Architecture in New York. Miguel Georgiev is an Argentinian landscape architect and co-founder of Atelier Coloco in France. So let's start with with our first two speakers to talk about what's the meaning of hope, and in particular, the book's chapters shows different scales and levels of design and collaborative practices, from large projects also to small bottom-up interventions. There are very creative collaborations among designers, like in your case, but also to traditional community design, from participatory processes with nature as a co-design for dealing with water. You both were discussing the meaning of collectiveness, using in particular two examples from the Netherlands, both of you. Peter wrote a manifesto with 8 landscape design firms, and Inge and Amina, who is online, You instead talk about the landscape microstory in which communities rather than designers are somewhat the protagonist of this collective design. So how can landscape design and different forms of collaboration open new doors to face climate and water challenges? How are designers a part of this collectiveness? And what is the landscape architect role? How can new or traditional knowledge become a hope for a collective design? What do you think about that?
Well, does it work? Yeah. I can tell from my experience of the project Onslaught that I described in this book. This was an event that was organized in the north of the Netherlands, where we invited 8 different design practices to collectively think of the transformation of a river system and take climate adaptation as the starting point for the question, what else can we improve? And what can, let's say, the long-term perspective mean tomorrow already for first actions that can be taken. What's interesting about working in such a group of landscape architects is that you can both address systemic challenges, but also dive into the details of the place and sort of jumping between skills, something that every landscape architect does in a way. Yeah, works so much better if you do it in such a large group, and we try to play with that throughout the process. Like, say, where does it help to go individually into details in specific places, and where does it help to bundle the energy and to create a collective voice of the group to address certain topics. And somehow landscape architecture is very often also moving in between politics and let's say local interests, and this was also the case in this project. And for instance, writing that manifesto was a very good step in also engaging with politicians and making them engage with topics we tried to put on the table.
So collectiveness to be together, even including the politicians, it seems like.
Yeah, it's always good to work all together. The topic we addressed in the article is an estate that had Langkate, and in that estate, there was really a question what to do with that. A large landscape, worn out, you could say, by agriculture, etc. So there needed to be a new vibe in that, a new water system. So a landscape architecture office and research was invited to look at the water system. And then by discussing with the owners, they decided, well, what used to be here earlier times, what were the tradition, how was this place used? So then these old memories came back, there was research done, etc. And then it seemed that these traditional water systems from the flooding meadows, how people dealt with the water, was something you could use maybe for today's change. And that's how the project started. And we thought, Amina and myself, Amina is a student from the lab Circular Water Stories, which I'm running here since 7 years. And in that lab, we always look into what to learn from traditional water systems. We said, oh, this is a really nice example where old traditional give new impulse to new ways of collectiveness. So in this Langkate estate, many people got involved. I mean, it almost become too dull to write down. We used more than one paper to name all the stakeholders which are in this project. And it is from the monumental association, but also what we call Staatsbosbeheer here. State forestry, but also communities, a cook from the village, people in the village who are interested in history, everyone joined in and became part of that. And I think strongly that being part of understanding, let's say, the landscape, creating the landscape, making, healing it, one could say, the water system in this case, cleaning the water, etc., became not only a research project, not only something the community like and feel home at, part of them, but also as a nice example for many other projects. So it is a quite small project, I think, with an enormous big impact on many people's, children's, etc., on many levels. But then the landscape architects and the researcher are really the starting point. They build up the framework, they have the knowledge, and from there, let's say, the communities and the people picked up. And what we heard while writing the article, almost every year new initiatives is related to that whole place. So it is really building the community.
So the landscape architects were first somewhat in promoting this micro story of change with water communities.
Yes, you could say that, and the researcher who really looked back into the past, but also the owners of the estate who really remembered what was happening at the flowing meadows, etc. And so altogether, they really try to make a framework for people to get engaged and involved and to learn from, carry it out, one could say, in a larger scale.
Okay, thank you both. We go to the second question, which is from Lizzie, who should be online. And her chapter is very different because we talked before now about two initiatives from the Netherlands, but in many Asian, Southeast Asian and developing region, we assisted to a sort of design imperialism related to water and climate issues. Most of the times you have top-down mega projects and knowledge becomes really very difficult to apply because there is an indifference to local knowledge and wisdom, indifference to local communities' desires, and the design very often is not site-based in terms of the social, economic, and morphological aspects. And design imperialism is a process justified mainly by speculation and profit. And on this topic, Lizzie, you unveiled how larger Western corporations sell inappropriate images of resilience. Where is the hope? How can we give a voice to the vulnerable, elevate local knowledge, reveal alternative models of collective design where landscape can be considered? Are you online? Yes.
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Yeah, thank you for that introduction. I'm sorry, my cat is being disobedient in the background. So yeah, one thing I wanted to kind of say to start is that I think, the kind of idea of design imperialism or this kind of top-down technocratic approach to climate change adaptation is in part certainly about practicing in a capitalist context and about speculation and profit. But it really also has to do with the way that designers and other technical experts often frame their work as kind of outside of politics. So we're doing design over here, we're doing planning over here, politics is somewhere else. And in my work, I'm not studying here in the Netherlands, but I do study Dutch experts in climate adaptation in an international context. And I do find that it's pretty common for them to characterize this work as apolitical. And so I argue that this is a problem when we talk about climate change because there's not just one answer for what resilience is for any particular site, city, community. And so I'm kind of interested in this idea of imaginaries of resilience, that there are multiple and even competing ideas and values at play when we talk about what resilience might be, for whom, where. And that's something that I think we really want to kind of, if we want to talk about a kind of more hopeful way of thinking about living with a changed planet, I think kind of acknowledging this political context is really important. And I don't think that that it being political is necessarily unhopeful. And so I think the kind of my interest in kind of what co-design might mean in this kind of context is thinking about how we might negotiate these multiple ideas or imaginaries of resilience from the kind of starting point that kind of big technocratic plans aren't going to do a good job at negotiating this, but also, you know, you can't see everyone from the top, you might say, but you also can't see everyone from the bottom. And so I don't think we can only say, well, every single plan must be produced by a micro local community. And I give some examples in the chapter of projects, counter plans, like the work of Urban Poor Alliance, who produced a people's plan in Metro Manila, which was really kind of in counter to a more top-down approach to negotiating climate change adaptation. And I think that approaches like that are interesting in part because they are directly responding to and therefore in dialogue with these kind of bigger picture visions of the future and contesting those directly. And so I think we might think of our work as designers as kind of negotiating between those kind of top-down ideas of how we might approach kind of large-scale systemic change, right? Because we have to think about that when we're thinking about climate change. Everything is entangled at every scale, but also how we might kind of translate that in the context of these kind of local and often suppressed imaginaries of resilience that have to do with locally cited knowledge and experiences. Thank you.
Just to follow up a little bit, what are the alternatives to these top-down uneven plans? What do you think would work better? Which are the secrets about it?
I think what I'm suggesting is that we kind of think about how we might work in between the kind of large scale top-down plan and the kind of micro local bottom-up plan. So how might designers kind of act as in a more mediating role in that kind of case? So it's not about one or the other, but rather kind of negotiating between both.
Okay, thank you, Lizzie. I have another question, but instead it's for Pippa, that I saw her online, and Miguel that is not connected instead. It's basically that we know that landscape architects has always been co-designed with natural forces, human and non-human organisms, plants, materials, and even at the nanoscale, bacteria, virus, fungi, algae, insects really can open up the experimentation of collaboration with other inanimate organisms. On this topic, Pippa, you and Officegate developed an experiment and a work with an oyster reef in New York, and oysters somewhat were your co-designers. Likewise, Joy de Combs also reconfigured the Eyre River bed in Switzerland by exploiting sediment flows, and that even became, in that case, the co-designer. Miguel himself, who is not present, he went under the sea somewhat. So co-designing with other species leads to intervention opportunities and integrates new intervention, or somewhat it's a little intervention that provokes somewhat the change of the environment. How does it emerge for design in your experience? What was your experience, Pippa?
Yeah, I think, there's this idea of co-designing and cohabiting at two scales, sort of the biological with other species that are inhabiting our shared environment and planet, and with the processes that shape it. And I think for a long time, and there's a history of infrastructure, particularly in urban context, of control, and the idea that we can control and master natural processes. And I think there's an increasing acceptance and realization that that is not not feasible, impossible, particularly in our urban environments, and particularly in the context of our rapidly changing environment, physical and climatic. And so, one of the things that we fundamental principles that we started with living breakwaters, and I think is important, is this idea of cohabiting and a certain level of humility, but commitment, the same way that we as designers want to design beautiful, safe, enjoyable places that people want to be, and places for all, and consider equity. We want to do the same as we start to think about and design for other species, and not what we think they want, but the habitats, the places, the conditions, and not in forms and structures, but also systems and networks, and the layers of food webs and ecosystems that they will need to thrive. And so, the oysters were inspirational as a keystone species, but it was really about designing for the forage species, the macroinvertebrates, the fish, and all of these layers for that. And I think the other part of that is a real, commitment to partnership and collaboration with the people who study and know these species and systems, and a commitment to really design the places for the other species. And we have this concept of reviving natural systems, and we're very intentional to not refer to restoring, because I think the reality is that we have irrevocably altered the planet in which we, and collectively we, us as human species and other species, live. And so we need to really think about and understand the conditions that are going to enable them to thrive and create them. So the living breakwaters don't look or feel or have the same form or shape as the historic oyster reefs that you saw or found in Tottenville, but they're there and intend to revive many of the ecosystem services that are there. And in the end, they're also for people. They're providing risk reduction, but also I think raising awareness about the complex aquatic ecosystem of the New York Harbor, Raritan Bay, where these species coexist, because by raising that awareness, understanding these connections, I think we engender an appreciation for the necessity of stewardship and cohabitation, even in our urban environments, and not just as this sort of abstract natural environment that is far away.
Well, it's also making an awareness of they exist and make them visible somewhat, even if as landscape architects we probably knew about it, but to recognize them somewhat in the project, it's enough somewhat. It's a first step, let's say like that.
Yeah. I think our skills of visualization and communication are not necessarily secondary to the actual places that we're making. I think that is part of our, our work and mission as designers is to be able to visualize and communicate these natural systems that people might not otherwise see or interact with or understand.
Thank you, Pippa. We go now to the second section of the book. The second section is called Soil Ice and questions the solidity, the age of ice in the area of climate change. The project noted in this section represents an attempt to raise public awareness and engagement on the issue of climate change, while also highlighting unexpected examples of the hopeful adaptation of some local communities. For example, Tynan proposes a temple material approach for co-designing with time on the Arctic Islands coast of Bjornoya. And in the following chapter, Clouse introduces the climate-adaptive artificial glacier projects of Ladakh, North India, as a way of integrating co-design by people and natural forces. Berger documents the collective work of researchers and students listening to melting glaciers in the Sweet South to raise awareness of our communality, interconnectedness, and responsibility in the climate crisis. So let me invite Carey to be sitting, and Inge Bobbink, who is moderating this session. Eimear is Associate Professor of Landscape Architecture at the Arctic University of Norway. Carey Clouse is an Associate Professor in Architecture and Landscape Architecture at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Judith Berger, who is not connected with us today, is a sound artist and a composer and educator with a background in electroacoustic composition, and was actually a research fellow at the ATH Zurich. So, thank you.
Yes, thank you. Right, need a microphone also?
Yes.
It's a lot to handle here, wait. Let's see if I can manage. Okay, yeah, it's really a pity that also Ludwig is not here, since, yeah, he is one who's not a landscape architect and researching on the same topic, like you do, and also...
He was also a landscape architect.
He was? Ah, I see. I looked it up. I couldn't find that. Okay, that's interesting. Okay, ice. I think, yeah, another beautiful material or status in what water is about. So that's really quite something, and maybe something we were not that aware that is so important to think about that. So in the article of Eimear, I think I have to see you on screen. Let's see. Yes, you are very much involved or thinking about time, and especially if you think about ice, that is really long time thinking, you could say. So you studied in the Arctic, as I understood. You went there many times to investigate mostly, you could say, the material of these processes, and you write about that. I would like to know, since you say landscape architecture is a future-oriented discipline, of course, we design for the future. You can speculate on how materials of these coasts are likely to change, and the environment and the climatic and political threats are likely to multiply and unfold. Rather than deny these changes, it has been more productive for you, that's what you write for me, to accept that all the materials I encounter are on changes. It has been more productive for me, on a journey, all these materials. Can you explain how this knowledge or how this insight that they're all on a journey helped you as a designer, or in what way does it feed you as a designer?
Hi, thank you, and congratulations to Laura for the book launch. It's really nice to join you today. But to answer your question, I'm living in the Arctic in Tromsø, living and working here, and teaching about Arctic and subarctic landscapes. And my research prior to teaching was involved with high Arctic islands in particular, which are uninhabited but have a rich history of different exploiters actually visiting these islands. So there's very rich traces to be found, particularly on the coastal areas, because the inland areas there's not as much to exploit actually in these inner parts of the islands. So the coastal areas were very, very rich with activity over time since the 1600s. So I was really curious to see how these islands have changed over time through photography, through climate analysis. And of course, there's really significant changes happening in these areas at the moment. The climate is warming at between 4 and 6 times more than the rest of the globe. So looking at historical accounts, it's very easy to identify major changes that are happening, where they're going from being a very solid environment for much of the year to a very fluid one. And that's why this book is very, very, very relevant for people who are interested in the Arctic, because there's so many different ways to explore all these elemental qualities of the landscapes that we encounter every day. So it's very relevant. But how does this inform an Arctic design? I think it's spending time in these places and exploring the methods that we use in landscape architecture. I think we could expand the way we do field work in landscape architecture, and also to take more time to explore these very vulnerable parts of the globe. And that's something that I try to do in my teaching as well. Try to spend time in the landscape with students, and also to teach that these landscapes change radically over different seasons and very different over a linear time, over several centuries, how they've changed. So I hope that kind of answers your question, Inge.
Yes and no, I would say. I think, as you mentioned, as a landscape architecture, it's super relevant and super important to go out there and to not only analyze, but observe, spending time, getting to know, etc. But then my question would be, especially in the Arctic, and you can note, of course, and you can maybe map and show to the world all these changes, and that they are quite fast and dramatic, and that maybe the time understanding changed in these places. But I wonder, in what way then do you, I don't know, interfere with that? Or are you in a dialogue? Are you designing with that? That's not so clear for me. I mean, you can describe, you can note, you can make people aware of these changes, but what is then the next step to do with that?
Yeah, I think a good example of that would be maybe the work that we conduct here in Tromsø. We do a lot of studio teaching based in the place that we're located. And so with our students, it's very important, first of all, to observe these different changes with snow at the moment, for example, snow, ice, rain, and drier periods. So how do you work with that if you want people to engage with the landscape all year round? So that's where these maybe aesthetic explorations come about, on how people can explore. Let's say this time of year, it's really that we get very little light, maybe 4 hours of light every day. So that you have very dark conditions, but the snow makes it quite bright. So there's lots of things, for example, you can do temporary installations, temporary design projects when there's snow. So it's this kind of responding to these rhythms of the seasons, even though there is unpredictability. So that's kind of one example. Another one is we have to deal with a lot more flooding in these areas, because when there's unpredictable snow melt in the winter period, it melts onto frozen ground. So the water is not infiltrating into the ground. So there's it's very important to identify these areas. The flood areas can be different in winter compared to the flood areas in the summertime. So I think it's that's why I think observation and getting to know these sites is crucial, because each season is radically different. The materiality is very different. The temperature, light, all of these things are very, very different seasonally. That makes these environments extremely precious and beautiful. So I think as designers, we have an obligation to embrace these qualities and to work with them.
I was also wondering, let's say these methods or these kind of way you look at these landscapes, and you write a lot about that you need to take the time to observe and to understand the material, etc. In what way are these approaches you are building up are relevant for other landscapes? Is it really something which is specifically related to, let's say, the ice or the Arctic condition? Or do you think you can get some learnings for other sites as well?
Yeah, I think one challenge, huge challenge in doing fieldwork in the Arctic is that the conditions can be quite tough to work in. So it could be, I don't know, between -10, -20 at sometimes some parts of the year. So you have to work extremely efficiently. So I think these exploring different ways that work in different conditions, just the practicalities of field work, is quite different to what I was used to studying and working in the UK and Ireland, that you have to maybe conduct fieldwork in lots of different ways at the same time and to work efficiently. But I think all of these are absolutely should be used anywhere. You know, I just think that living and working in the Arctic has made me realize all these kind of more raw landscapes and these elements that we essentially have to work with all the time. I think my education prior to this was very much there's big emphasis on vegetation and water, and now it's much more about these raw materials and ice, fog, all these other special qualities that are here. But it is transferable absolutely to other places. And I'd just like to add that I don't think it's a coincidence that in this chapter or this section of the book, there is an interest in sound. And I think that says something when it comes to ice and melting and snow as well. The sound qualities of these spaces change so much in the winter period, which makes it another special quality.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, I can imagine. As I said, a pity that Routledge is not here to talk about that, because it was a really very tactile, very precious topic, I think, to talk about, the notion of sound in that. But I also would like to ask you a few questions. Carey, you wrote the article Building Up Water, and you talked about building these stupa in what kind of region was it? You can say
North India, in Ladakh.
In Ladakh, exactly. So we are moving to the higher altitudes, not so much to the North Pole, and it was a kind of rediscovery of how you could store water. And how did you get to this topic? I was wondering. And I'm very intrigued by also the not only technical or restoring or retaining water by these stupas, but also interested in the meaning of these stupas for the people who build them. Would you say a little bit more about that?
Sure. So artificial glaciers have existed in Ladakh since 1989. That was when Chouaïri Northwell, this engineer, started building these enormous sort of flat landscapes of ice to sort of hold water for downstream farmers to use in the next spring. And those landscapes exist today. You can go and look at, maybe 24 in Ladakh that exist that are over a mile in length. Sorry to use American miles instead of kilometers, and up to 20 feet in depth. So there's these immense caches of ice. And what's so interesting about those is I went there over the course of almost 10 years, just going back in the winter and in the summer to sort of look at these landscapes and to study climate change adaptation more broadly in the region. And one of the things that I was always surprised by was that these artificial glaciers were almost tucked away, like not registering on anyone's radars. The villagers who produced them, and they did this collaboratively in large work parties, including with youngsters and elders. They knew they existed, they knew how they worked, but no one was sort of selling this idea of an amazing design sort of landscape, right? Oh, you could ice skate on. You could have tours, you could have parties on these landscapes, and yet they were sort of subdued. And then about a decade ago, in the winter of 2013 to 2014, and this is in the period when I was doing a lot of studies in the area, Donna Wangchuk, who's another local engineer, but also just a political activist and an educator in Ladakh, had this idea to sort of make the artificial glacier vertical. And he developed this system of piping. He created a team of people. They call themselves the Ice Stupa Project, and you can read about their work online. They're doing these competitions every year, including this year, to have local villages produce their own ice stupas. And the idea there was that instead of having the ice, the water caught and made into ice in sort of flat plains, that it was sort of piped up to this point, and then it would spray off and create this sort of vertical tower of ice, which they called, I think, geniusly, a stupa, an ice stupa. And that was an effort to sort of connect it to Buddhism, which is one of the two dominant religions in that area. When they did that, a couple of things happened. There was this sort of display of a tower of ice, which drew lots of people, not just the downstream farmers, subsistence farmers, but also monks and important politicians and people from the army and a lot of tourists. And the monks left the stupas and they adorned the stupas with prayer flags, and they became religious symbols, places where people had events, cultural events. There would be music and dance, performances out in the open air underneath these stupas. And so what I saw was this amazing sort of idea of sort of creating an ice cache to sort of protect your farm for the next year. On the one hand, and sort of this very practical landscape, which is a climate adaptive landscape in this area. And then they were overlaying sort of social, cultural, religious, and even some economic programming. And these sites just became hyperactivated, and they garner a lot of attention. They're more effort than it takes to create a regular artificial glacier. But they're just a lot of fun. And so for me, one of the things that the threads in this book that I just think is impossible to sort of wrap my brain around, and also really exciting, is this idea that like we can look into the future and be optimistic, right? Like that there is any hope at all, right? Right. Yeah. And Laura kept saying, so can you address the question of hope? Oh, come on, yeah, the glaciers are melting. There's no more water. And so these sites in particular, because they were activated with all this additional programming, because they're created with very few materials, made by individuals who have a stake in the process, but not a lot of design training. For me as a designer and an educator, I just thought, oh, this is where the hope is, right? Like this is, if a village can make something like this work, then, and it's a replicable model, and it's elegant, like why should we worry, right? Like we can do this.
Quite helpful what you were just saying. Yeah, no, really nice to hear. And I think in all three articles in this chapter, I think there is in that sense a lot of hope, because it is not only addressing, let's say, the practicality, but it is addressing, as you say, the tactileness, the understanding of time, and the massiveness, let's say, of the ice and the sounds of that. And as you're saying it, that they created a ritual or a spiritual experience. So it is all about this awareness thing. Would you agree on that?
I do. I think that part of the problem with climate change futures and sort of imagining a way forward is that it's really hard to get people to agree on the fact that there is a problem and that we need to do something about it. And what I felt was amazing in Ladakh is that suddenly there was this symbol that was visible, and it was a way of sort of helping everyone connect to what is really sort of an environmental problem and climate change adaptation project in their own way, right? Like it sort of pulled people together, and that to me I think is really exciting.
Yes, thank you very much. I will give over to
we have a 10-minute break, and then we come back with the gaseous form of water. Thank you all. Okay, we can restart with the final session. So the final session works with gas, fog, and clouds, and collects design practices related to the first state of water. And these include projects and natural phenomena dealing with water and atmosphere, compromising landscape practices and artistic intervention aimed at making water from clouds, fog, and moisture. Cipriani and myself described the cloud gardeners that cultivate clouds in dry regions of the planet. And this entails many different ways to work with clouds, even rethinking the shapes of the clouds. Mosbach presents the Phase Sheet Park project to highlight how new water is cultivated by the biomass introduced by it. The water cycle relays light from the depths or roots of the foliage, which evaporates the surplus in the form of oxygen into the sky. And the last chapter of this session is from Abdessemed and Boraven, present their microclimatic installation at the Architecture Biennale in Venice, which feature an accessible indoor cloud. The experiment is not far from humans' control of weather on a global scale. Let me introduce Nadir Abdessemed. He's a mechanical and aerospace engineer at Transolar in Germany. You already know Carey Clouse, and Carey will be moderating this session. And Christine Boraven is a trained architect in Transolar in Germany, but I don't see her connected. Thank you. Want to switch?
Great. Okay. So, can you hear me? I might not be on. Can you hear me out there? Great. We can hear you. Oh. How about that?
Yes.
Better. Good. So I found this section of the book just fascinating because it attends to the ethereal, unwieldy sources of water, gas, fog, and cloud. And you've described a little bit about these chapters already, but in the first two papers, the authors discussed quiet, natural processes, exploring these less heavy-handed design possibilities. And I thought we would take questions first from Laura and Catherine, and then I had a second question for you, if that makes sense. But I wanted to ask you two, how do each of your pieces attend to the lack of physicality, shape, and substance of condensation and evaporation? Does landscape architecture have a role to play in making these processes visible, in informing people or sharing knowledge and expertise through the language of design, and do the themes of co-design and hope begin to anchor these projects in any fundamental way? So I think we have the questions up there. That's great. And Laura, would you like to start?
Condensation and vaporization are two processes of the change of state of the water on the vapor state. And usually we can distinguish three approaches to co-design with condensation and vaporization. On one hand, usually we had for many years that science has always been trying to understand the atmospheric condition. And we can think about people like Lamarck, who were the first people to conduct scientific studies on that. They also looked at the shapes of the clouds, the altitude. He started a nomenclature. And nowadays, mostly starting from the 50s, there are many technical sciences that are experimenting with the possibility of interfering with clouds to encourage precipitation. And this is the so-called cloud seeding. Probably you heard about it. You basically have these planes, cannons, ground devices that really try to induce precipitation with dry ice, salt, and etc. And then we have landscape architecture that has been worked for many years to somewhat to work with this the vapor state, I would say, of clouds. but it was always pointed out a scenographic effect most of the times. And so, which is very nice, very poetic, but it doesn't go to the root of things. So I tried to find in the chapter a third way, and the third way is the one that is called the cloud gardeners, or the gardeners of the cloud, which are humans, but also animals, plants that are capable of cultivating water in conditions of scarcity. In places where you don't have water at all, what do? And sometimes actually fog and frost, the dew, they are actually very helpful to make an adaptation and to help to create somewhat water. And so this is very interesting because it doesn't also open up the idea of imagination, of other possibilities that are coming from different living organisms. I'm thinking about, for example, in regions where it never rains, in deserts, we have plants, insects, bacteria, microorganisms that really use the vapor state as a vital source. And for example, in Namib Desert, there is this unpredictable phenomenon of fog, and there are two kinds of beetles, so little animals, right, that they actively collect the fog by basking in the leaves and capturing the droplets of water through the growth of their carapace. So really, other beetles also make structures to capture the fog. Even some animals are equipped also with a kind of storage mechanism to keep this embodiment of keeping them alive, and also deal with the fact that fog is not always present. And this happens also with plants. So these, I think, they are the cloud gardeners, really, because they can cultivate grain. And we can learn from that, and this opens up, something different from us. And this is very different from Clouse Sweden, for example, what we do. So coming back to your question, landscape architecture definitely has a role to play in making this process visible. You were mentioning about traditional knowledge. Yes, there are also very interesting samples of traditional knowledge of how to make water from fog, for example. But above all, really, the lesson is actually that we can learn a lot from Mother Nature. And they have a wisdom that it's hard to tell, but wisdom and beauty itself. So it's not only a matter of the wisdom, but also the beauty of these marvelous creatures or marvelous interventions. I hope I replied to your question.
Wonderful. Yeah, it's so powerful to think about just paying attention. Catherine, are you there?
I don't think
good afternoon. Do you hear me?
Fabulous. Can you see the questions on the screen?
No, I don't see the screen.
Okay, would you like me to, why don't I read them again? They're the same questions just asked with Laura. It's how does your piece attend to the lack of physicality, shape, and substance of condensation and evaporation? Does landscape architecture have a role to play in making these processes visible, in informing people or sharing knowledge and expertise through the language of design? And do the themes of co-design and hope begin to anchor these projects in any fundamental ways?
Okay, I will try. Most of people think that the water is coming from up to down, from the clouds to the soil. And in fact, the researcher demonstrated that is as much water coming from the down to up, from the soil to the clouds. And we need both direction to cultivate water. And on the other hand, main briefs, and especially in urban condition, is request to push away the water as fast as possible, which is a little bit totally 100% not productive, as it should be done on the inverse, means keep as long as possible the water on place. So means to do that, in whatever territory you work, tropical humid or continental or whatever you work, we need to multiply the strata, means the canopy of the trees doesn't work on the same time, on the same level, catching water with evaporation and running off as the shrubs, as meadows, herbaceous, as soil. And what happens over the ground is the similar process underground with different strata of roots. So it means to cultivate water, we need to multiply the different strata on the same place, which is really too sparse. And in fact, if you do that, means to keep the water on place as long as possible, to cultivating and to nourish the water lift, means when happens an extraordinary event like overflowed water, it should be an emotive and a sensitive event and not a drama. Means whatever happened, it should work on real life, in urban condition, in landscape condition, but it should be, I mean, an emotional and aesthetic event and not a drama, as it happens every day in all places of the world. So it means landscape design is a really, really extraordinary tools to highlight the process. We have not 100% control, but we can orient it, and it's hopefully we don't have 100% control, but we can highlight the process to highlight the resources as 100% continue self-production, and we are just a small part of it. But the design is really, really a good tools to orient it. Those cycle, I mean, it's a life cycle, combining the elements with the animals, with the plants, and the human design. I mean, our design is just a small tools in the system, but the small tools in the system can demolish the system, and that's what we should share and highlight in the landscape design. I don't know if my answer is absolutely give to your request.
That was perfect. Yeah, I was so impressed by the park itself and thought, you know, to what extent are you actually, sort of helping visitors see the processes that you've considered, because they can so often be invisible. But that's very helpful. And I think we'll move to our next question now. So you have yes. Aha, there. Okay. So the section of this book, it kind of highlights, at least for me in my reading, this continuum of positions about when and how design intervenes in natural processes. You know, from the cloud gardeners, where it's like, you know, sort of pay attention, Mother Nature is wise. Maybe we don't need to intervene, or maybe we can sort of learn from Mother Nature, to all the way over here, a project which takes the idea of intervention to the extreme by literally fabricating an indoor cloudscape, right? So we have an engineer. Could you speak to the role of the designer and then the limits or extents of control as you saw them in this project, which is fascinating.
Well, thank you. Well, at first, I would like to clarify that, you know, this project, Cloudscapes at the Architectural Biennale, as you just described it, you know, like literally bringing a cloud into the indoor space, could be understood as like an anti-landscape project, right? Because it's so much architecture and, or maybe the combination of architecture and augmenting climate as we know it from typically outdoors, such as clouds. So I would just like to put this into context of, you know, what we typically do when we work with landscapes in a very sensible way, to really understand these physical effects of, as Catherine just described, moisture, for instance, condensation, evaporation. And as such, that Cloudscapes project was probably more of a model of a cloud rather than cloud in itself. So what is a model? A model is kind of a, you know, simplification maybe of a typically complex phenomenon, let's say. such as clouds, as we know it, and we know that clouds can be very, very complex, and there's this nomenclature that Laura just described to describe the different shapes of the clouds with complex Latin names. But what they all have in common is that normally warm and humid layers of air coincide with cold and dry layers of air, and then you have this concept of condensation. This is exactly that phenomenon that we try to bring into an indoor space, which has its limitations, where we learned to actually really appreciate the power of clouds. Literally, there's a lot of energy in a cloud. Also, if you then look at the different seasonalities, there's so much energy inherent in the air. Moisture itself contains more than 100 times more energy compared to, let's say, heating up water. If you want to evaporate water, you consume orders of magnitude more energy just to bring it into a gaseous form. That was kind of a very powerful learning also for us, where the limitations are. Obviously, cloud becomes something very continuous inside the space. This is also a concept that the architects are very interested in, and defining space rather than by walls, let's say, through like a non-physical continuous change in atmosphere, let's say. And this goes hand in hand with the challenges, as you can imagine, of scale, bringing it to a fairly small scale of the Galleria in the Arsenale, 7 meters high, a very old building, where you can't just define the climate as you want it. But yeah, 7 meters height to create these 3 distinct experiences. I don't know if you could see one of the images here. So you enter the space, it's clear, you have a cloud hovering above yourself, then you walk up a ramp through the cloud, and then you end up above the cloud again, like as you would experience descending, let's say, or mounting up with a plane. Here we see it. So to compress what typically happens within a kilometer, so to 7 meters, is associated to limitations, obviously, also the interaction with humans. We have children running around in a circle, creating like a negative pressure inside that circle, and like a vortex dragging down the cloud, almost like a hurricane or a tornado spinning, literally. And we ran these experiments, and then also learning that the cloud stabilizes again after some time. We have learned a lot about thermodynamics, humidity, how we are also limited in terms of separating cold from warm, just using, let's say, classical air conditioning strategies. As you heat up the ceiling, let's say, or the layers above the cloud, I don't want to get too deep into the thermodynamics of the cloud, but it's hot at the top and cold at the bottom. And although the air may be nicely stratified, there's still an exchange through radiation from the hot ceiling to the cold floor. So this is very much associated to the cold night sky that you have outdoors in landscapes, interfering or nicely interacting, actually cooling down our planet after it heats up during the day. In fact, that's the only source of cooling we have. That effect is basically interrupted through CO2 or too much CO2 within the atmosphere. So that cloud represents a lot of the phenomena and concepts that we face within landscape architecture. We learned a lot about its limitations and try to take this also when actually shaping landscapes outdoors.
Yeah. Wonderful. I mean, I think what united the 3 pieces for me was this idea that we can pay attention to the process. It's so basic, but I think it's really sort of it's under taught in schools, and unfortunately not many people write and talk about ethereal moments that you can actually, engage in this kind of quite exciting. Great.
Thank you, Carey. Before we move, I must also thank Catherine Mosbach that I didn't present. She's the principal of the renowned landscape firm Mosbach Paysagiste in France. I didn't know that she was connected.
Okay,
So,
sorry.
yeah, and we moved to the final part now because the last chapter from Knox and Holmes goes to the roots or meaning of co-design. Highlighting a symphonic choreography of all planetary forces involved in the water cycles and beyond. It's a kind of interdependent dance that can listen to the cosmos needs and employs aesthetics and techniques to address the climate crisis. Robert Holmes is an associate professor and chair at the undergraduate landscape architecture program at Auburn University. Emily Knox is assistant professor of landscape architecture at Auburn University. Please, the floor is yours to finish and to end and to conclude our book presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. I saw maybe note quickly, since the publication of the book, Emily has joined me as also an associate professor and also chair of a program. She's chair of the graduate program. Now I'm chair of the undergraduate program. So we are the chairs together of landscape architecture at Auburn. I think for us, this book chapter emerged out of a realization that we were both using this language of choreography. I think ironically, we around the same time had pieces come out in different places. Hers in a journal called Wonderground, mine in a book that I co-authored with some colleagues called Silt Sand Slurry. But we wrote this pair of pieces that had almost the same title, mine Choreographing Sediment, Emily's Choreographing Desire. And they both came out of observations that we were making in the realms that we were working in. So for me, that was work that I was doing with colleagues in a group called the Dredge Research Collaborative, where we have been studying kind of human sediment handling practices, how people intervene in the world of sediment. And for Emily, it came out of work that she was doing on rangelands, on kind of large-scale landscape management through the kind of choreography of grazing animals. And we both were, I think, kind of coming to this common language, which is not, it's not the kind of native language of those places. Dredging contractors who are maintaining navigation channels don't talk about their work as choreography. Ranchers who are herding sheep or cattle don't talk about their work as choreography. But we both were finding that we felt that language was appropriate to describe the way that these practitioners who are making landscapes, but not framing their work as design, not working within the conventions of landscape architecture. We felt it was appropriate to kind of describe how they were working as choreography. And so we were very excited by this kind of different mode of landscape making that we were observing. But I think it's important to emphasize that it was the kind of positions that we take on what choreography is and the observations that we make about it are observations. They're not kind of invented in the sense of being kind of projections of what might be. They're observations about what is happening, even if it's not happening that much within the field of landscape architecture. And I guess our desire to kind of bring the things that we were observing in separate domains together came out of this desire to see kind of, we were both writing about what choreography meant in a particular world, and we were curious what was kind of common and core and what might be extracted from those observations in particular places to a kind of theory that might be more generalized for landscape architecture of what choreography is. That felt necessary to us for maybe 3 reasons. One, because in both cases, we're feeling that there's a significant disjunct between the kind of scale of the need for work, the scale of the need for landscape making in response to crises like the climate crisis, and the scale of the capacity of the tools of traditional landscape architecture, that those tools are suited to making landscapes on scales that don't respond to the scale of the need. We also, I think, both had we had spent a lot of time in the landscapes that were being shaped by the sediment choreographers, by rangeland choreographers. And I think we both felt that there were kind of incredible experiential and aesthetic qualities to those places, not qualities that are necessarily the kinds of qualities that are found in typical designed landscapes, but in fact ones that maybe at times are richer and more interesting to us as landscape architects than much of the kind of products of professional practice. So we felt there's a kind of flattened quality that is present in many landscapes that are produced through the kind of relatively bespoke, relatively controlled tools of traditional practice. And we were interested in how choreographic practice might expand that. And then lastly, I think this one ties kind of directly to the aim and theme of the book as Laura set it up, that there's also a kind of desire within the field of landscape architecture to expand who and what has agency within the making of designed landscapes. And it seemed to us that in both cases, in the landscapes of sediment and the landscapes of rangelands, that expansion was happening, and it was happening through the work of these practitioners that we're characterizing as choreographers. I'll let Emily talk a bit about kind of what we feel like we actually found and how we would describe choreography as a practice.
Yeah, so it looks like you can hear me just fine. I think maybe to repeat a bit of what Rob said, this chapter is really about a fascination that Rob and I have both cultivated about the other people who make landscapes out in this world and the tools that they use. And again, we were working on this very separately in the same building, but kind of unknowingly. And I think we've ended up kind of spelling out 4 pieces that we think are core to what choreography is. And those were really born from, common language that we found in these 2 different landscapes. And we've kind of spelled them out in relation to traditional practice and the differences a choreographic practice might have to traditional practice. And the way that choreography takes place in these 2 different landscapes and a couple of others that we introduced in the chapter are quite different. Choreography can take multiple forms, but we do think these kind of 4 pieces are core to any type of choreographic practice. So the first is intervention in process is kind of the fundamental way that design takes place in choreography. So this is sort of understanding ecological processes, landscape processes as a really rich, deployable design tool. Ecological processes are endlessly generative if they are allowed to unfold. And so fundamentally, choreographers work via the kind of intervention and engagement with processes that are already existing in landscapes. This is kind of counter often to the way that landscape architecture practice works today, in that it is very anti-specification. There's very little specification. There's no planting plan that occurs in a choreographic practice. The practice is fundamentally about processes. And so in rangelands, that is about the kind of interaction between the creature and the ground, the plants, the soil. In Rob's case, it's far more about these processes of sedimentation, which vary quite highly depending on what sort of landscape that you're engaging with. So that's the first piece that we think underlies every choreographic practice. Is fundamentally it's about an intervention in ecological processes that already exist in the landscape or can be introduced into a landscape. The second is about interaction and engagement. So choreographers, we think one of the things that makes choreography so different from traditional practice is that choreographers are in a very long and constant conversation with landscapes, very different than, again, a sort of planting plan, which is built to some specification and kind of maintenance is applied to maintain that particular built form. Choreographers return again and again to the same landscape to learn and to observe and to kind of shift their response. So in that way, the practice is very open-ended, it's very adaptable, it's very responsive. Yeah, again, that occurs very differently in these two different landscapes. But in each case, the rangeland choreographer returns each year to the grazing to the grazing allotment here in the United States. It occurs in other ways in other parts of the world, and in the same way, a sediment choreographer might return much more frequently to adjust and to make a new set of decisions about how the landscape is evolving over time. So it's a very time-based practice that could occur kind of continuously. There's not a start and an end date in choreography. The third piece is about observation and embodiment. So this is very connected to the second point here, but in both cases or in all cases of choreography, observation and embodiment are critical. So this piece of the choreographer being present in the landscape in one way or the another. So again, this can occur in very different ways, but this practice of observation and learning about a landscape. In the case of rangelands, this is about a person on horseback that is spending every day in the landscape. It's a very sort of simple way of observation. It's very different than in a landscape of sediment, where some of that might be more technologically mediated with LiDAR and these more remote sensing tools. But in either case, choreographers must observe, and they must use those observations to learn to make a new set of decisions every time that occurs. Let's see. The fourth piece then is unruliness and releasing control. So again, I kind of mentioned this in the first piece, is the unruliness that's kind of latent in landscapes we find to be wonderfully generative and something that can produce form sort of beyond the capacity of a human or a designer in the way that we think of traditional practice, but actually allowing these various co-designers, co-agents, whether it's a process which is occurring or the cow that is being choreographed around the allotment, that the unruliness that's inherent in those co-actors is can be incredibly generative if we sort of allow ourselves to deploy them in that way. So much of choreography is, again, it's very anti-specification. It is more about sort of loosely, the designer's role in that case is more about loosely setting parameters that those processes and those co-agents can kind of react to and respond to. So there's, for instance, a fence line. Something as simple as a fence line can be something that is designed and articulated in the ground that is not, that is more about allowing processes or those co-agents to be held within those parameters in certain moments. much of that is about releasing control and knowing that giving the kind of co-designers agency to make their own decisions based on their own kind of tendencies, their own behaviors, and allowing much of the kind of generative form making work to occur as a result of those co-designers reacting to the more kind of simple parameters that you've set up in these landscapes. So yeah, I think what is maybe to kind of conclude that the unifying piece to all of this that I think makes both of us very excited is that they combine to create a practice that kind of finds the balance between the technical and the poetic. So you must know a lot about these landscapes in order to choreograph them. You must know about the kind of technical nature of the co-designers and the processes that unfold. But in kind of allowing for unruliness and releasing control, you are able to kind of leverage those technical components to produce something that is far more complex and far more poetic in all cases of the landscapes we've described.
Thank you, Emily. Thank you, Rob, for your concluding remarks on what's the meaning of choreography. Can you listen? Thank you, Emily and Rob, for your concluding remarks on the meaning of choreography. And before I ask the public to have some questions for our speakers, I would like to promote and have a look to the book, for this wonderful book. So just buy it, and it's online. You can find it in the website of Routledge. And then I will ask to somebody who has a question in particular or a curiosity to some of the speakers. And thank you all. Thank you, Emily. Thank you, Rob. Thank you to all the speakers actually that came live in presence and online for this book presentation. We will have some drinks right next to us, and yeah, write a book.